Hi, I'm Time for Miracle, and this is the first in what is potentially a series of videos that I do on specific strategies or game plans that are strong in the current Mechabellum meta. If you're wondering why you should care about what I have to say regarding this build, I hit rank 1 in the 501 server playing almost exclusively Stable Mustang, and it peaked rank 2 worldwide and 2500 MMR. I have also streamed more than 100 hours of this comp alone on my Twitch. As a disclaimer and reminder before we begin, Mechabellum is a very complex game. When you consider using information and strategy that I offer in this video, please remember to consider your current board state above all else and trust your intuition on whether what is correct or not. That being said, let's get into it. Today's composition is Stable Mustang. These units complement each other well by providing AoE and chaff clear from Mustangs, comboed with single target and tanking from the steel balls. Many units can be splashed in this composition to address the current board state, but these are the core. Let's talk about the core units in the composition and the role they play. First up are steel balls. Steel balls are the anchor of the composition. They're also giant slayers and shield breakers, meaning that they are very good at killing high HP units quickly and effectively. They can be converted chaff through the use of the mechanical division technology. They can also hold defensive items very well, and they can even be a finisher through the use of the link tech. Next up are Mustangs. Mustangs have a variety of roles they can fulfill, but most often you'll see them as chaff clear, the high explosive tech, or as the main DPS, particularly if you have any DPS items or good utility items for them to hold. These are generally the main two units you want to itemize and consider how to best enable when playing the composition. They complement each other well through their combined mix of frontline, single target, and area of effect damage, but you'll almost always want more than just these two units on your board. Next, let's talk about the splash units. There are many units that you could splash into this composition, however these are the ones that I use the most in my games and the ones that I would like to recommend to you. First is the Crawler. Crawler is a speed match chaff with the steel balls and Mustangs, meaning that they all move at 16 meters per second. They can be a good tempo generator if you've used the replicate tech. They're also exceptionally good at flanking and manipulating aggro. Next, we have the Phoenix. Phoenixes fulfill a similar role to steel balls. They're giant slayers and shield breakers through the use of the charge shot tech. They can be a backline carry if you need it. They can also be a really good counter to Vulcans through the use of the charge shot tech. They can be a very good unit to buy against hackers because they can kill your hacked units very quickly and effectively. This is particularly important for steel balls since they are very poor at killing hacked units themselves and can often cause a snowball effect for the hacker. It can also be a good potential pivot point if you need to go into an elite marksman type build if your steel balls are being too countered. Next up is the Wasp. Wasps are very versatile, just like Mustangs. The role they might most often fulfill for you is as aerial chaff, meaning that they are immune to fire and storm colors, most notably. They can also be a good flanker, particularly when comboed with mobility beacon. They can even be a Mustang replacement under certain circumstances, although this requires you to take particular technologies to make them fulfill that role. They also have very good finisher potential through the use of the jump drive tech when deathballing, which means that you stack lots of wasps on top of each other, and use mobility beacon to get them to go into a tower or fight a certain target. Next, let's talk about the Overlord. Overlords are also very versatile. They have a variety of tech options that can help match your playstyle. Most often, though, they'll fulfill the role of Giant Slayer or Shield Breaker. They're also a very good finisher or endgame transition. They hold DPS items very well and can provide frontline support through the use of the Photon tech to make your frontline beefier. Next is Stormcallers. Stormcallers are the premier shield breaker for most compositions in the game. It's no different for Stable Mustang. Sometimes you may use other units to do that instead, but they're still really good at shield breaking. They're also very good at killing giants or large high HP units in general. They can provide incendiary and electromagnetic support if you need that in your composition. They're also very good backline carries, particularly with launcher overload if you have fed steel balls that can frontline for them. They're also good DPS item holders, just like Mustangs and Overlords. Next is the Rhino. Rhinos can be a good finisher or flanker, particularly when comboed with mobility beacon to kill your opponent's tower quickly. They can be a good anchor when comboed with the photon tech. However, do note that this is even more vulnerable to hackers than steel balls tend to be normally, since they are one unit rather than four. Next, we have the Arc Lights. I would like to say up front that I wouldn't necessarily recommend you combo Arc Lights this composition often, but if you happen to start with them because you have a starting specialist or unit combination that includes them, then perhaps sometimes they can be a good Mustang replacement or allow you to skip high explosive ammo in favor of more single target damage. They're also a good potential backline carry transition against certain compositions through the use of elite marksman. They can provide electromag to your team, which you might not otherwise have unless you have it on Phoenixes. They can, in particular, be a good weak side anchor, which means that if you're playing an asymmetrical board, that you have the arc light on the side of the board that you have less units on. That can be really good at killing crawlers, killing flanks for you, that sort of thing. It can also be a main anchor if you get the heavy arc light tech. It does increase its HP enough that it kind of functions similarly to a rhino, but once again, we have the issue of this is very vulnerable to hacker. And speaking of hackers, that's the last unit we have to talk about. Hackers are a really weird unit, but most notably they can be a anchor if you get heavy hacker. This does, once again, have the same vulnerability to hackers as the other units do, because they are just one unit, but hackers can hack other hackers, so they have that going for them. They can be a really good bomb rhino counter through the enhanced control tech. They can also be a good anti-hacker finisher with the enhanced control tech as well, meaning that you can take it back your own rhinos, steel balls, arc lights, whatever your anchor happens to be, but you can take it back at full HP, assuming that your opponent does not also have that tech. Sometimes this can let you kill your opponent before they can stall out your board with their hackers, so I think it's a pretty good option to consider. Next up, let's talk about positioning. So there are a few ways to position this comp. To start with, we'll talk about asymmetrical and symmetrical non-aggressive positioning. So to begin with, let's talk about the chaff. So for crawlers, you usually start with 3, and probably not going to buy more in the first round, but if you do, you can position them first 2 in these spots. If you have more, then you can position them on the flanks. And if you have 5, you can position like this. This one catches summons in the middle, so that one's quite good. You can also position them behind towers like this and build 3 on one side if you want to. If you want to leave the side completely open and play fully asymmetrical, that is completely fine. There's lots of different things you can do with your crawlers, but I will just say that these are the most easy to deal with, or easy to position with, to get the highest value out of on average if you position the rest of the comp in a standard way I'm about to show. So, there are other things that you can do, and I would encourage you to do them if you think that they could get value that way, but that's the standard way. Next, let's talk about how steel balls fit into this. So, steel balls can be positioned like this, one space behind the top of the crawler. Just one space, like that. And 2 or 3 spaces away from the crawler as well. So if you do 3, then sometimes they'll get pulled quite far into the middle on these left steel balls right here. And if you do 2, then usually they will go for the same target. It just depends on positioning, but that's the spacing I tend to prefer. For steel balls, it's not very complex. There's not really a whole lot of thinking to be done with them. You can play them symmetrically, like this, rather than fully asymmetrical. Both are completely fine. I would encourage you to do whatever makes most sense to you as a player, given your game state. Next is Mustangs. Mustangs are a little bit more complex. So for Mustangs, you can either position them 0 spaces behind your steel ball, like this, or 2. 2 is stronger against being sentry missiled, because if your opponent has sentries up here, that will kill both of your steel balls and your Mustangs if you have them like this. Whereas if you have them like this, then your Mustang will not be able to be sentryed, and only steel balls will. Obviously this one-shots all of them if you do not have life absorption or level 2 on your steel balls. That would be quite bad if that were to happen. So that's why I tend to prefer 2 spaces back. However, 0 spaces back does provide you more DPS uptime on your Mustangs. Both have merits, just depends on your game state. One extra thing I'll mention about your Mustang positioning is that if you position them 2 spaces back and 2 to the right, like this, specifically the flank Mustang, this guards against aggro manipulation stuff on your flanks, especially crawlers, because your opponent can manipulate your left and right forces to arrive at different times if they put one crawler right here. If you have high explosive ammo and you do not yet have range, then you can clear out this pretty quickly. Whereas if you're over here, then you have to walk quite a distance and it does not happen very fast, which will mean that your forces arrive at different times and allows your opponent to focus down one half before the other half arrives. For that reason, I like to do this quite often, but you don't have to do that. It's just something to think about, especially if you're anticipating being aggro manipulated. That being said, let's talk about the units. So the next unit I'll mention is the Overlord, or Boat, as I like to call it. So boats are quite good in this positioning with photon emission because it hits all of these steel balls except for 1 and about 4 or 5 Mustangs. You can do the same thing over here, doesn't really matter too much, but this is generally where I like to put them for DPS uptime. Next is Rhinos. So as I mentioned in this video, I think that Rhinos are a bit of a weird add to the steel ball Mustang composition because it increases your vulnerability to hackers. However, if you do have a Rhino from Rhino Specialist, or you have some other reason for wanting a Rhino in the game, I typically like to put him either behind the steel balls and the Mustangs where he arrives a little bit late, or you can put him up front if you want to take him aggro first. However, both are fine. I would just encourage you to do whatever you think makes the most sense based on your current board state, but either one is fine, somewhere back here. Probably in front of this rear crawler, is what I would suggest. Next thing that we could talk about is storm colors. So storm colors, I tend to prefer either like 1 to 3 spaces ahead of the tower and 2 to 3 spaces to the right or left of the tower. Typically, I play asymmetrical, so I'd put like 2 on one tower if I were to buy more than one. But if you play symmetrical, then you can just do them middle, like this. It's not really a big difference either way, it just depends on where your opponent's positioned. Often you won't have these on turn 1, but sometimes you can play this board from turn 1, starting with storms. As of the current patch that we have, Missile Interceptor, that is a bit less of something that makes very much sense, but it's definitely something you can still do. I would definitely not be afraid of buying storm colors in this composition, especially because of how well they work with launch overload in the board. But if you were to have them with or without overload, this is about where I position them, especially because you're probably not going to buy them with overload in the first turn. So if they do not have overload, this is completely fine, and once they get it, that's fine too. They're quite fast at that point, and they'll catch up really well. So the next unit that we have to talk about is hackers. So hackers belong in kind of the same spot as the boat or the stormcaller. Depending on if they're heavy or non-heavy hackers, they'll have a little bit different of speed bracket, but I think it kind of washes out. Probably just like about right here is completely fine usually. Sometimes if you're afraid of them dying to storm colors and they're not heavy hackers, you position a little bit further back if you want to. Try to leave space for your boat so that you can vote on at some point if you need to. And yeah, other than that, it's mostly just like trying to point them at the thing you're trying to hack, or if you just want them to be bubbles, like this, then maybe you want to position them somewhere like here, to where they'll block like storm color shots or whatever you want for your steel balls. But anything is fine for hackers, mostly contextual. If you do have arc lights on the board, I would prefer to position them somewhere kind of up here in like the storm color speed bracket. Typically they'll arrive at a good amount of time to clear out colors, whatever you want. It's not too important. Oftentimes you're not really investing into the arc lights this composition. But if you are, definitely up here is fine. It's not too much to be worried about. They usually be pretty safe right here, and we'll get focused first. For Phoenixes, I think they're a little bit like hackers. You probably want to try and point them at whatever you're trying to kill. But if you don't have anything in particular that you're trying to do, then either behind the Mustangs or behind the crawlers, if you don't have this crawler right here, is completely fine. It's not too much to be thinking about with this. They'll usually be pointing at whatever you want them to point at, because you have the HE Mustangs to go out shaft. As for Fangs, this is probably the most complex unit in the board, but let's talk about it. So for Fangs, if you don't have any idea where you want these, I would recommend that you do 3 spaces ahead of your tower, as so. That may be 4, I think this is 3. I would count 3 spaces ahead of the tower, and I'd bring them to the edge of your formation over here, and go 2 or 3 spaces to the right. In the case of the thing that's closest to your flank, you can position them really far to the right if you want to. I tend to do like 2 to 3 spaces away from the side, but the ones that are over to the left are much more important if you're playing asymmetrical, so let's talk about that for a minute. So if you do something about like this, and you have 4 or 5 spaces in between your fangs here, you do some very powerful things. So suppose that you have nothing over here, okay? Suppose this is your entire board, you have everything stacked over here, right? This is very risky looking, right? However, if your opponent has stuff, they'll get chained onto this fang right here. Everything will aggro here to this fang, it will not aggro to your tower. So the danger is that they will kill this fang and then go to your tower, right? However, if everything is still going this way, because of this aggro chain onto this fang at the start, it will typically chain its aggro onto this fang and then onto everything you have up here. Or even it will just go from this fang into this stuff in the first place if you're fast enough. But this is a very strong position that you can do to avoid having to invest into the side. It is very weak to, stuff being placed like right here and going into your tower. But if you have fangs from the start, I wouldn't recommend necessarily that you build these to accomplish this like after the start of the game. But if you start with fangs, this is a powerful thing that you can do to prevent your tower from dying. Is they will initially latch onto these, and they'll latch onto these, and then latch onto your stuff over here, rather than going for your tower. That's a pretty strong early game thing that you can do with fangs, because fangs are rather weak for the most part. It's typically not a unit that you really want in this composition, other than for like blocking sentry missiles or something like that. Crawlers accomplish that just as well. So yeah, this is something strong you can do, something I would think about. Typically if I start with fangs, this is what I'm doing. I am positioning them like this, with the spaces in between, to avoid having stuff aggro onto this tower, and having this one over here just as a sentry missile blocker or something like that. Last unit is wasps. So oftentimes you don't really want wasps in this board. Often you're just clicking shield on them for your mothership on your overlord, and then you like sell it, or you just put it off on a flank or something. But if you do want to put wasps into the board, I'd recommend that you put them behind the Mustangs, or just like the very back if you have jump drive clicked, because they have higher speed at that point. And I think that's pretty much every unit. If you start with marksman, if you start like a marksman Mustang start, you can position them kind of like up here with the arc lights. Probably in about the same spot as him. They're about the same speed. I wouldn't recommend that you get them for the most part, but if you have them, that is where I put them. And that's pretty much every unit. As far as asymmetrical or symmetrical goes, you could just mirror this on the other side if you have symmetrical. But if you're aggro, that's what we talk about next. So if you're going to position aggressively, I'd recommend that you almost always start with crawlers. It is possible to do the same thing as this with fangs, but if you have fangs, it is quite weak to being sentry missile. Therefore, I'd recommend that you do not go for that. So if you do start with crawlers, something like this is completely fine. If you position one space ahead of the back of the crawler right here, then you will open yourself up to being sentry missiled on one steel ball if your opponent chooses to go for that. Whereas like this, you are not sentry missilable. It is important to remember that the placement of your opponent's units depends or determines whether or not this is possible. If they are, for example, right here, right in front of you, then you are not sentry missilable because your units will walk in a straight line. But if they are turning like this, then you are sentry missilable. So it depends a little bit on that. But like this is generically good, and I would recommend that you go for this most of the time. If you want to be a little bit greedy on your DPS uptime, go for this instead. It's a pretty small difference though. So much like the backwards positioning, or delayed, if you want to call it that, this is the position that you want to go for. Unlike that, you don't really have to worry about your flank guard or stuff like that, nor do you really have to worry so much about storm missiles. And in fact, I would definitely strongly recommend that you do them directly behind if you're going to go for this positioning. Because that way you are least vulnerable to Stormcaller Incendiary or Vulcan Incendiary, stuff like that. Part of the point of these crawlers like this is that they draw all the Stormcaller missiles or like Vulcan Incendiary into these spots, and your Mustangs are in a different spot to start with, right? They'll walk up like this. In this case, they would walk directly into the tower like this. But for the other parts of this formation, over in different parts of the board, you would achieve the intended results. The fire would go here, and you would walk straight or off to the side, depends on how the board's set up, of course. But this is generically a pretty good positioning, and I would recommend that you just place copies of this across the board as you see fit. So oftentimes this is played asymmetrically, so you would have this side like this, and you would have something like this on the side that is weaker. You protect against flanks and stuff like that, or just your tower being pushed in general. This is often what you would want as a setup, is like one crawler and one Mustang. If your opponent develops something substantial against it, then you could go for, well, I didn't mean to make that level 2, but there we go. You put another steel ball Mustang over here. Oftentimes, maybe you just want to position both these things up here, just like on the other side with some colors, but it's really up to you. Oftentimes I choose to make the board fully asymmetrical, so one side is aggressive like this and one side is delayed. But really, again, it's up to you in your current game state. So if you want to add things like rhinos into this board, you can position them either like behind or ahead of the steel balls. Just like I said earlier, the thing to think about with the head is that you're going to be sentry missiled, so oftentimes I go for behind all this, or just off in the corner, or maybe even in the center with a mobility beacon. Something you do too, something like this. But really, rhinos are quite niche, so just depends on your board state. As far as overlords go, they fit rather nicely into this formation. They just go right here and they hit everything with their photon. It's super good. Stormcallers are something I would tend to position just behind the Mustangs. It is a little bit slow in this board positioning. They don't really tend to arrive like exactly when you want them, but they do have quite a lot of range to begin with, and if you give them range, they're going to fire like immediately almost. So definitely they're not bad in this spot, but not quite as good as the other positioning, because they'll not fire before your forces get there necessarily. Hackers, if you have bubbles, are excellent position up front. Prevents your stuff from being sentry missiled, especially if they're heavy hackers, then they're really good in this spot. But if they are not heavy hackers, maybe sometimes you want to put them in the boat spots and give them range. And they can hack from much earlier in the fight and be quite safe. Do note that this is not sentry missilable, I believe, especially because the hacker is slower. So if you want to do wasps, just like before, I would recommend that you put them behind the Mustangs, or even further back if they have jump drive, as in this case. But if you have like all these units, maybe you just want to position them behind the Stormcallers, or maybe even just like right here vertically, or something like this. It really doesn't matter too much with wasps. And that is pretty much every unit that you might want to put in here. I suppose that if you have arc lights from your start, then you can position them like this behind the crawlers. That's stuff like completely fine, but it might, be in the way of your boat for later on, so maybe you want to sell it at some point. Same goes for marksmen if you have them. And any giants are a bit hard to fit into the sport, so I wouldn't really recommend that you do this positioning. But if you do, I think there's space in front of this, right? Yeah, there's space here. But this is very bad for giants, as they will be automatically locked onto by melting points, whatever, so I'd not recommend buying them here. Probably want them on your other side of the board that's delayed, if you have that. I believe that is every unit. If you have fangs, you can technically replace these crawlers with the fangs, but I would not recommend that you do this, because like I mentioned earlier, you can be very easily sentry missiled because you will not have crawlers to walk up to protect your steel balls. You know, your opponent can have the option of putting the missile back here, and that will cause your steel balls to be hit when they walk up, right? Because the fangs are rather slow. Even if you have mechanical rage or like speed on them or whatever, typically they're going to start shooting at something before the steel balls, or they're going to start shooting at something, and it's going to cause steel balls to get sentry missiled at some point, because your opponent can position this wherever he wants, right? So it's quite hard to engineer a situation where he cannot missile you if you have fangs instead of crawlers. So for that reason, I would try and stay away from fangs. But if you do have them and you didn't have any other starts that you want, or any other unit starts that you want, then that's where you could put them if you needed to. But yeah, that's basically every unit. Definitely, I would recommend that you position this however makes the most sense to you, but that is a good generic positioning to start with. Once again, just have these colors here. Final thing. This is definitely what I would recommend just as a generic thing to do. You can build as many copies of this across the board as you need to. So, after seeing these different ways to position the board, I'm sure you might be wondering yourself, why do I care about positioning one way versus the other? And to that, I will say to you that it is a very complex topic. It also depends on your playstyle as a player. Maybe you really like playing aggressive and pushing your opponent's tower, or maybe you like to play a more standard game with everything in the back of the board, and you like that better. They definitely have different pros and cons, especially with regard to like how it allows you to utilize different units in your composition. If the backwards positioning has much more capability to utilize basically every unit in the game, whereas this positioning has much more restricted positioning and units that you can use in the composition. That being said, once again, I think it mostly depends on your playstyle and what you think your opponent will do. But the strongest thing that I'll mention as the current patch is the missile interceptors. These things are very powerful with the aggressive positioning because they do live between rounds as of the current patch. This may change in the future, but as of right now, they do currently persist in between rounds, and with this positioning, it is very likely to be the last thing alive on your board, which makes it so that these things will tend to snowball. They will live multiple rounds, they will provide your board lots of defense if your opponent has storm colors, or maybe Vulcans that send your missiles, or something like that. So for that reason, I think the aggro positioning is quite strong as of this moment. That may change in the future. I definitely think that both positions have a lot of merit. Both positions are completely fine, and you can definitely climb as high as you could ever need to with either positioning. Personally, I've done almost all of my gameplay with the backwards positioning or delayed, but definitely there are lots of players that play exclusively the aggro variant. Both are great. So I'll just say that it mostly depends on what you prefer playing as a player. If you like playing aggressive board states, if you like playing asymmetrical board states or symmetrical, but mostly I'd say it's up to you. Just have fun and do what you think is good based on your current game state. Or based on your opponent's units, and it will probably work out just fine. Now let's talk about the cortex and the composition. To start with, the most cortex for this composition, in my opinion, are energy absorption on steel balls, high explosive spam on Mustangs, and perhaps as a close third, we have charge shot on Phoenixes. I'm not going to cover every tech for every unit that could be played, just the ones that I see as most commonly applicable and my reasoning for the core unit techs. So, for steel ball, let's talk about the techs. First up, we have energy absorption. This is the one that I mentioned as being most core. It allows steel balls to lifesteal off of things they hit. This is good for obvious reasons, I'm sure, but also it has the really nice benefit of giving 60% max HP. This is additive with other sources of max HP, including items, etc. So that's something to consider when thinking about it, but it is the most common tech that you want to get in the comp, besides high explosive ammo. The next tech on the list is damage sharing. I think this tech can be a good finisher. I don't currently have it active because I think that since armor got buffed recently, that it's maybe a little bit better to have on your bar rather than damage sharing. But if you like to have damage sharing as a finisher option, or potentially as a option against hackers, since it does increase your max HP, which makes you harder to hack, that you can run it as well. Range is probably the second or third most common tech that you will be clicking on steel balls. It is really good in the mirror for this composition if you're against enemy steel balls. It could be really good if you're behind an XP in particular, because all that really matters is whether you lock onto the opponent first, not really whether or not you have more HP or damage in steel ball mirror. Next is the mechanical division tech. This one is very, very good. It has been nerfed recently, but it still is very good at allowing you to make your steel balls turn into chaff, which is sometimes a benefit if they haven't snowballed very well. Note that this does not scale with your level at all on your steel ball. It's always exactly the same. But it is something that can be very good if you are not letting if your steel balls are not getting to snowball. this is a good option to give them continued use so that you do not have to sell out of them. Do note that this is very bad against hackers, because if your opponent hacks your Mechanical Division Steel Ball, then they now have a Mechanical Division Steel Ball of their own. So I'm sure you can see why that's not very good. Next up is Armor. As I mentioned, this was buffed recently. It gained 20% max HP, making it sort of similar to Energy Absorption in terms of how much HP it gives. This is a very, very niche tech. Most often you would only want to click this versus Vulcans that do not have any damage items or techs clicked yet. It's also good against Mustangs, but in general it's pretty niche tech. It's not something that you're going to click every game, but it definitely is something you can get value out of, particularly if damage items have not rolled in that game. Next up, we have Heavy Targets. I won't go into this one too much, just know that it's very, very niche, has very limited use in the current game. It does have some applications if you combo it with range enhancement and maybe get a laser sight on your steel ball to give it even more range, but overall this is a very hard tech to use. Currently it doesn't have much use at all other than if you're able to put a steel ball right in front of something on the flank and allow it to lock onto it immediately with heavy targets. But this is, again, a very niche use. Next is the Mustang. Once again, the most core tech in my opinion is high explosive ammo. This increases your trap clear dramatically. However, it does, interestingly enough, give Mustangs a overkill issue, which they otherwise do not have, because normally Mustangs have projectile flight time of almost 0, so they rarely overkill anything. But with high explosive ammo, due to the splash, it actually overkills quite a lot on chaff. Even that being said, it's incredibly, incredibly good. Still definitely want it in almost every game. And it's even really cheap too, right? It's quite nice. It's 200 supply versus 300 for most of the other techs. And if you're wondering about like whether or not armor-piercing bullets is a good replacement for high explosive, by the way, since it's a 50% attack boost, you'll notice if you put it 1v1 against one pack of chaff, these are very, very, very similar. But you'll notice that high explosive ammo starts to just pull way far ahead once you have more than one pack of chaff, or if the packs of chaff are split out across like different areas of the battlefield, which is like much more similar to a real combat situation, like a straight up 1v1, right? That being said, armor piercing is very, very good. Currently, I do not have it because I'm experimenting with Missile Interceptor, which I'll talk about in a moment. But armor piercing is excellent. Mustangs hold damage items very well. There's no difference in what this provides you than a damage item, other than the fact the value is half as much, or 4 times lower in the case of the 200% damage item. But this is very good tech. It's also very cheap, right? So definitely a great option. Never unhappy to have this. Never unhappy to have it on your bar to click in the first place. Next, let's talk about aerial specialization. In the case of the Steel Ball Mustang comp, this isn't something that you very often want to click. It's much more on the lines of something that you want to click reactively to something that your opponent is doing on a different type of board. But it is something that I think is worthwhile to have on the bar because it is such a good counter to things like Overlords and Wasps if you need that. Notably, we do have high explosive ammo already in most cases, so we're already pretty solid against Wasps. But if you do need to kill Overlords, or perhaps you need to kill some Phoenixes earlier than you might otherwise be able to, because this does make you prioritize area units, right? If you need to kill the Phoenixes earlier than you might otherwise be able to, then perhaps sometimes you can click aerial specialization and accomplish that. It is worth noting though that often Phoenixes are outranging this, so it's a bit hard to use it against them. It's more of a Overlord tech, anti-Overlord tech. And I believe that just leaves Missile Interceptor. So, I'm just going to say right off the bat that this is a tech that will win or lose you the game a lot of times. I'm not going to go too much into it because there's a lot to say about this tech, but I would recommend that you stay away from this unless you're very, very confident that clicking it in the first place will win you the game. As a general rule of thumb, for your information, if you're going to consider using this at all, in most cases, you need an equal supply of Mustangs invested versus whatever supply of missiles that your opponent has. That does not just include Stormcallers, that includes incendiary bombs from Vulcans, it includes oil bombs from Vulcans, it includes Overlord missiles, which are about the same as the rest. It's a little bit more inconsistent because they're quite fast. It also includes electromagnetic barrage from melting points. It includes a lot of things. So that being said, I'm sure you can imagine how this could quickly become problematic for you if your opponent is spamming Giants these abilities, because you cannot spam Mustangs as fast as they can spam those Giants due to the deployment limit, right? And this does not scale with your level at all. Nothing helps it at all. The only thing that makes it any different is how much they have intercepted during the current turn. So it's a very hard tech to get a lot of value out of. Sometimes it can win you the game, especially if you have smart decision making around it. But once again, it is quite hard to use, so I would not recommend that you click this very often. For most players, I'd recommend you use this setup right here. Now that we've covered the main units in detail, I'm going to go over the other units a bit more quickly. Let's start with the Phoenix. So for Phoenixes, the only tech that I would absolutely recommend that you have for this composition is Charge Shot. Charge Shot is very, very good for the reasons I listed earlier in the unit section. But I will say that this is your most core tech. It's also one of the cheapest, which is another plus for it. But other than that, you can pretty much use whatever you want. I think that probably the most non-negotiable tech is range enhancement. That's the one that I would encourage you to always have in your bar, but you can get away with not having this depending on what types of boards you like playing. The one that is most noteworthy is Electromag, I think, because you don't have very many units in this composition that can have Electromag in the first place. So having it on your Phoenixes is a nice way to get it. It's also quite cheap. It is worth noting, though, that if you already have Charge Shot, this can be quite expensive. So something to consider. Next, let's talk about Overlords. So Overlords, much like Phoenixes, they have very, very versatile tech options. You can put pretty much whatever you want here. Things that I would encourage you to include most often or to not consider dropping is Photon Emission. This is probably one of the most core or most useful things that you can have. It's very hard to go wrong with this. Overlords can be a pretty inconsistent unit at times, with their firing interval being so high. They have projectile flight time that is quite significant, and they can also have a hard time hitting very fast units. But the way that you can get guaranteed value out of Overlords is with Photon Emission. Increases your front line significantly, and also makes you immune to Electromag, which is a very dangerous thing for Steel Balls to have to deal with in the first place. So, for that reason, this is the one that I would recommend you to have the most often, and it's also the easiest to use. Perhaps as a close second for that, could be Launcher Overload. I think it's the tech that most reliably increases the DPS and just general usefulness of the Overlord. But also, Overlord Artillery is another good option. It does have some pitfalls surrounding its range. The range of this cannon is always the same. It's always 120, which can have some issues since the Overlord is 110 meters range, which can be modified upwards, and this cannot. This does also scale with any damage modifiers you have, by the way. It is not always 12,000, but the range is always 120, which can be a bit odd. As far as the other techs, though, I think you can take pretty much whatever you want. Something that you will not see very often, but I think is very good, is high explosive ammo. This especially improves your matchup against other steel balls quite a lot. But again, I won't go into these too deeply because these are up to you, mostly. Pretty much you can take whatever you want. The ones that I would recommend you stay away from the most is armor enhancement and field maintenance. These are kind of a trap that I see, I guess, newer players use, but they can be used to high level play too. It's just not quite as widely applicable. Most often you see Overlords in a carry role, not a tanking role. But it is something that can work. Photon has very good finisher potential, by the way. It's something that your opponent can be not expecting if you don't have any Overlords already. Particularly if they are relying on Electromag to stop your steel balls from snowballing and killing their units, or even just the slowdown part of it. And also just having your front line be 50% tankier is often quite an appealing proposition for the amount of money that you have to pay for the Overlord. Even if you're not like Giant Spec or Aerial Spec, it's 950 supply, which is quite expensive relative to the Photon Emission tech. But it's definitely something to consider as a finisher, particularly against Electromag. It is worth noting also that Mothership can serve a similar role, with Shielded Wasps in particular, especially if your opponent is relying on a Elite Marksman type backline, like, say, Marksman or Phoenixes to kill your Steel Balls, or perhaps your Overlord. Next up, let's talk about Crawlers. So, there's an awful lot that I could say about Crawlers, but this is a video about Steel Balls and Mustangs. Therefore, I'm just going to talk about the things that I think are most relevant for that comp. The way that I play Steel Ball Mustang is very tempo heavy, meaning that I think Replicate is one of the best things that you can consider to try and get value out of with Crawlers. So it is worth mentioning that you have to win the round for this to do very much as far as tempo, but if you do win the round with it, the Crawlers that it generates deals HP damage to your opponent. So that's very good. It's also very cheap, right? So it's not really too much of a commitment, especially because most people are not clicking text in their Crawlers every single game. So I think the Replicate is quite good for that reason. It also can allow you to win flanks you might not otherwise be expected to win. And on that note, Impact Drill does a very similar thing. Impact Drill takes your hits that you need to kill enemy Crawlers from as many as 3 to as little as 1. Most often it takes it to 1 as long as you're the same level. And another interesting thing that you can do, which is why I mentioned 3 hits to kill rather than 2, is you can click HP up in your command center, which increases your your HP by 15% for 100 supply. What that does for Crawlers is it takes them from 2 hits to kill to 3. So if you do that and your opponent does not, then you can win a flank that you might not be expected to win. Impact Drill does a similar thing, takes you to 1 hit to kill. Obviously this costs more supply, but this also has a bit more effect, right? It can kill your opponent's Crawler, then it one-shots the command center, comes and kills the board much faster, etc, etc. So quite valuable in that regard. And also if you're cost control, you can have some issue in Crawler Mirror, and this allows you to fix that as well. Note that I believe Command Center HPM does not allow you to fix that, so that's why I mentioned Impact Drill specifically. Next, let's talk about Stormcallers. So Stormcallers, I think, are very, very versatile, but let's talk about the way that they're used in this composition in particular. So I think that these 4 techs are the best techs for just about every comp in the game. Not to say that the ones that we're not clicking are bad, but that they are perhaps less generally applicable than these. Therefore, these are the ones that I always use, and I see most players use as well. So the techs that we think are most valuable for Steel Ball Mustang and the Stormcallers is Launch Overload in particular, I think. This might be a little bit controversial among some players, but I recently learned that this tech is very, very, very good in this board. In particular, the movement speed is very relevant because it allows them to keep up with the rest of your board, and they just deal like pretty gross DPS, especially if you have a damage item on them or anything like that. They also hold utility items very well, so that in combination with Launch Overload is super good because you hit more often, hit harder. It's also worth mentioning that you can click basically every single one of these techs in a Steel Ball Mustang comp, but you need to watch out for killing your own units with Incendiary Bomb in particular. But definitely Electromagnetic Explosion can get a lot of use because it applies electromagnetic interference on hit, and that can be very, very good at countering enemy Steel Balls, or perhaps just they have some sort of like Vulcan that you want to turn techs off of so that you can kill it more easily with your Steel Balls too. But once again, all these techs are viable to click. I think the ones that you'll get the most use out of is Launch Overload and Electromagnetic Explosion. Next up, let's talk about Rhinos. So much like Crawlers, there's an awful lot you could say here, but it's a bit outside of the scope of this video. So let's talk about the ways in which they most readily interact with the Steel Ball Mustang board. So like I said earlier, Photon Coating is very good as it allows them to function as an anchor, also gives them immunity to electromagnetic interference. Perhaps the most relevant tech other than that is Final Blitz, which allows the Rhinos to explode. It's also very worth mentioning that you can kill your own Steel Balls with this, so you need to be very careful if you're clicking Final Blitz, and make sure that you either have range in your Steel Balls or that the Rhino will not die next to your front line. Especially need to be wary of Sentry Missiles with this, because it can cause the Rhino to be slow and inside your front line, as opposed to walking ahead and away from your stuff so that it does not kill it. Other than that, I will say that these techs are some of the most versatile. Power Armor is something that some people don't value very much because their opponents do not play around Sentry Missiles very well, but if your opponent does, or if you're just a higher elo in general, I think that it's a tech that is very core on Rhinos, unless you're playing Anti-Missile Mustangs to provide immunity to that instead. It is worth mentioning that almost all these techs are clickable and good. In particular, Wreckage Recycling is something you can get a lot of value and tempo out of on flanks. You once again win in a place that you might not otherwise be expected to, much like Impact Drill and Replicate. So I think that can fulfill a similar role, and it's even cheaper than those techs too, so it's a very interesting thing to consider. Outside of Final Blitz, if you don't want to take this, I would recommend that you take Mechanical Rage, which allows your Rhinos to carry even better than they otherwise can. Finally, we have the Wasp. So I'm sure it's immediately obvious that Wasps have quite a lot of techs. So, rather than try and talk about all those, I'm just going to say up front that I think the most valuable tech for most players, and especially in this composition, is Energy Shield. It is worth noting that if you're really, really favoring the Death Ball playstyle that I mentioned earlier with Mobility Beacon, that Ground Spec and Jump Drive are the most critical, but Energy Shield is the most widely applicable tech for just about any board in the game, but especially this board if you're comboing with Mothership Overlords in particular. However, that being said, you can take just about any of these, and in particular, the Elite Marksman tech is very interesting, as well as the range tech to allow them to outrange Mustangs with anti-area specialization. However, you can customize your Wasps to do pretty much whatever you want. You can even try and make them Mustang replacements with high explosive ammo. Lots of really interesting things that you can do with Wasps. Very cool unit. One of my favorites, in fact. That being said, once again, you can do pretty much whatever you want here. These are the things that I favor doing because these are the ones that lean into deathballing with your Wasps the most, and also allows you to play Wasp carry with range. But it is worth mentioning, once again, that you can do just about anything you want. Don't let my techs be the things that you feel like you have to stick to. You can do pretty much whatever you want. Just make sure that you stick at least with Energy Shield. That's pretty much it. Next up, let's talk about items. To avoid heavily rehashing earlier portions of the video, I'm just going to go over these pretty quickly and try and mention whether or not I think they're good on tanks, carries, or support units. So Haste Module, definitely a good carry item. It is worth mentioning that if you put this on a Mustang, that you have to make sure that you position it further back, otherwise it will walk ahead of your Steel Balls and die. Element Module is pretty good for a lot of different reasons, can allow you to do some very interesting things, but most often I would consider this to be a support item that you can use to do some interesting plays. Anti-Interference Module can be very, very good for the electromagnetic immunity, especially on a Steel Ball. However, I would not often take this over 50 supply, so it's something that I think is pretty niche. If you are in a situation where you already find that you need that sort of immunity though, then it's very, very good. Laser Sight is exceptional on Mustang, can also have a little bit of utility on Steel Ball, but most often I put this on a Mustang or a Stormcaller. Heavy Armor is one of the best items for its cost to like benefit ratio, especially for Steel Balls. Pretty much always put this on your whatever your anchor happens to be. Most often it's going to be Steel Ball though. Firepower Control System is very, very good for any carry. Enhancement Module is something I often skip because it's very hard to get immediate value out of, and I value tempo quite a lot. Charge Demo is very, very good for Mustangs. If you don't know, by the way, this is a 5-second duration flat, which is a bit different from how other sources for electromagnetic interference work. But this one is 5 seconds flat all the time, which I'm sure you can imagine is quite good on a Mustang, has very, very high uptime. Photon Coating is something that we can get already from other sources, but it can be very good early game, especially on any sort of anchor. Nano Repair functions pretty similarly. It's a very good item for an anchor. Often has a bit of issues though against burst damage, right? So against some boards this does get very low value and I might just skip for 50 supply instead. Portable Shield is an interesting one. Ostensibly it's exactly the same as Heavy Armor for most cases. However, it does not allow you to lifesteal that HP pool back with energy absorption, and it also is HP pool that cannot be hacked, which is actually bad for you. Because it means that if you have this item on your Steel Ball and your Steel Ball is getting hacked, that HP does not count towards the amount of time that the Steel Ball takes to be hacked. And if that HP is still remaining after the Steel Ball has been hacked, then you have to deal with that HP now rather than your opponent. So I'm sure that is obvious why that is bad. I'm not saying this item is bad in general, but it can have some pitfalls. Definitely I would not avoid taking it for those reasons, but it's something to consider if there are already hackers in play. Just, so that you know that it's not actually going to help. Amplifying Core is very, very good on either a carry or an anchor unit. It really doesn't matter which one you put it on. Most often I think that I tend to put this on Steel Balls if I have the option to. But if you don't have item slots, then it's perfectly fine on a Mustang. Especially, most notably, it helps against Incendiary with Mustangs. The HP is pretty relevant. Barrier is good for any giants, but we're not really talking about giant units for this comp. Super Heavy is very, very expensive, but it's definitely still something that's very worth buying on Steel Balls. I was often very afraid of this when I was a newer player, because it costs an enormous amount, right? It's like you're really, really heavily investing in that one unit. But it turns out that having one unit snowball extremely hard is very, very good. So I would definitely highly recommend that you take this, unless it is extraordinarily early when it comes up. And even if it is, I would still heavily recommend that you consider taking it. Same goes for the damage version of this item. It's exceptional on Mustangs. Even if you have high explosive ammo, you may be a little bit afraid to take it because you're like, I don't know if this is actually going to be that useful since it's mostly chaff clear. No, actually it turns out that if you put this item on a HE Mustang, most often it's going to be the top damage in your board, no matter what text it has equipped. So this is a very, very powerful item, especially on units that have very high damage reliability like Mustangs. Parasitic Ammo is a item that is both very good for and very good against this board, because the Parasitic, if your front line is collapsing, is very hard for the rest of your board to deal with, particularly your own Steel Balls and Phoenixes, Overlords, that kind of thing, even Stormcallers, especially Stormcallers perhaps. So it's both a blessing and a curse if this shows up. It can be very good for you, it can be very good against you. It just depends on the board state. But I would pretty often strongly recommend that you consider, can I get some value out of this by putting it on a Mustang? Because, you can just turn your opponent's chaff into your chaff. It's quite good. And that's pretty much all the items. I will mention that I think that it's worth thinking about how good are some of these items against this board. So let's talk about that very briefly. Most notably for me, all of the damage items, Haste Module, Improved Firepower Control, and Advanced Firepower Control, and Amp Core. All of these, including Charged Ammo, by the way, and Parasitic, are very, very scary for this board if they're comboed on a Vulcan or some sort of other unit that is very good at killing Steel Balls. In particular, Charged Ammo Vulcan is quite bad quite bad for you as a Steel Ball player, because it turns off your energy absorption tech, and Parasitic Ammo, like I was talking about earlier, can be a blessing or a curse, depending on whose board is more weak to it. But especially in the context of damage items, I would say those are the most dangerous things to the board to watch out for. I would say that if you already have HP items or regen items or shield or whatever, that they're not quite as impactful, but if you find yourself in a game where lots of damage items roll and many defensive items do not roll, that you can be in a really tough spot. So that's something to consider when considering should you pivot or should you stay with the board. But most often I would say that if you find lots of defensive items, that means you're in a very good spot. Next up, let's talk about unit cards. To start with, we're going to go over the thing that I think is the best for this comp, which is Heavy Mustang. It's also very common, so you'll see it pretty frequently in most of your games. So the reason that this card is good is because the HP increase is very, very relevant against the Mustang's probably hardest issue that they have to deal with, which is Stormcallers. Against a equal level Stormcaller, a Mustang will survive one missile with this card. It also increases their durability versus fire by quite a lot. Enough, in fact, that often fire just does not really help very much at all against heavy Mustangs. And it's also really worth noting that the range decrease is not very impactful. Even though I mentioned earlier that the range check is quite good, the range decrease on this card is not impactful enough for you to consider not taking it when you have steel balls as your front line, or anything else that's like a short range anchor. If you have arc lights, you could run into problems taking this card because your Mustangs will tank rather than the arc lights, but in that case, that's a bit different of an issue, right? But in any case, this is one of the best cards for the comp, so I'd heavily consider it anytime you see it. Any of the subsidized cards are also quite good, particularly the subsidized Mustang, as this one costs 50 less supply than the steel ball card, but any of them are pretty good if you already have like the counterpart on the board. If you have a lot of Mustangs and you see a subsidized steel ball, that's pretty good because you can buy your steel balls to combo with your Mustangs and vice versa. It is worth mentioning once again that the steel ball card got nerfed recently, and it now costs 50 supply in addition to the opportunity cost of missing the 50 from skip, so it is a bit less efficient than the Mustang card. Other than that, there are not a lot of cards that I think are very, very useful for this composition. You can take the Phoenix cards if you want them, if you see them. But most notably, I think, are the Elite cards, which are quite rare, actually. You'll not see them very often. But if you do happen to see cards like Elite Mustang or Elite Steel Ball, then I think they're pretty okay to take. If you do see them, maybe you want to sell your existing units if they're not already level 3 or more, and replace them with these. It is worth mentioning, by the way, the improved steel ball card, even though it is very rare, which if you're not aware, by the way, the reason it is so rare is because if you already have any steel balls, either you or your opponent, you will never see this card. But if you do not have any yet, and this card comes up, it is completely fine and pretty good to take, I think. You may be a bit worried, much like I was originally, that the movement speed from it is actually going to be a bad thing rather than a good thing. But I think it's actually pretty much a good thing. It doesn't really disrupt your movement or your positioning very much at all. And the regroupment cost is not really that big of a bad thing. It's sort of like half an amp core, basically. It's like half a amp core's HP, more or less, a little bit less, and a little bit more on the attack side. Which the attack is not quite as relevant as the HP is, and this HP and attack are additive with other sources of that, but I still think it's fine for 50 supply. The card itself does cost 50 as well, I believe, in addition to the 50 opportunity cost from skip, but I think the card itself is pretty good if you ever see it and have the opportunity to go for it. Once again, it is quite rare though, so it's not often you'll see that, but I just wanted to mention it. Regarding which units that you start with, I definitely could try and recommend you pairs of units that I think are better than others. I think the most important thing is that you as a player feel comfortable with the start that you're given. That being said, I think that most often you want to try and start with crawlers as your chaff unit rather than anything else or any other 100 supply unit, because it is the most flexible and useful in the composition, and it's much easier to position with than things. That being said as well, I think that arc lights and marksmen are definitely one of the ones that you want to stay away from, but if you like using them, then definitely feel free to. But again, I think that starting with chaff at all is pretty good, and starting with crawlers is preferable to fangs for most players. Beyond that though, I would not recommend anything in particular until you get to very high MMR, at which point I think that you want to try and stay away from steel ball starts if you can. Oftentimes you cannot, but if you can, I would like to try and stay away from those, because if your opponent starts with sledges, which is very common at high MMR, they're very likely to place them vertically, and if they place them vertically, that is quite bad for you as a steel ball player. Therefore, I think that it is preferable in most cases to avoid having steel balls in your start, but again, oftentimes you cannot. But if you can, I think I try and like to avoid it, and would recommend that you do the same. Oftentimes at lower MMR, you may not find this to be an issue because your opponent may not know to place their sledges vertically against steel balls, but if they do, then it can be an issue for you, so therefore I'd recommend that advice to you as well. But once again, in general, I'd just recommend that you play with the units that you find most easy to start with in the early game, that you know how to navigate the best, and that fit you the best as a player with your playstyle, because that is the most important thing. Next up, let's talk about starting specialists. The way that I'm going to structure this is we're going to talk about things that I think are the worst and the best to begin with, and talk about specialists in general. So, to start with, the worst, by far, in my opinion, is Elite Specialist. It has issues at both low and high MMR due to its limited flexibility. Therefore, I would recommend you stay away from this at all costs. I would click pretty much anything else, even if it's something you don't know how to play, before I would click Elite Specialist, in most cases. The best, by far, in my opinion, is Quick Supply and Supply, and to a lesser extent, Supply Specialist, or Cost Control Specialist. But the reason I think Cost Control is to a lesser extent good is because the penalty that it carries. This penalty is multiplicative rather than additive, so it is quite a bit more significant than it may seem at first glance. It is worth mentioning, by the way, that all the other specialists, including the ones that are not in this picture right now because it's only the level 2, quote-unquote, according to the game, those are also fine, but these are the ones that I think are most impactful. It is a bit controversial, by the way, but I think that Speed Specialist, as a starting specialist, is quite good with this board as well, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, with the 16 to 19 speed breakpoint. But it's not really something that you have to take super often, and I would definitely take an Econ hero over I would take Speed. And it is worth mentioning, of course, you can also get Speed later in the game, but maybe it's also important to mention that you lock your opponent out of getting Speed Specialist if you take it at the start. So, lots of pros and cons to this, but definitely I think Speed is quite good as well. I would not hesitate to take it. The second and third worst, in my opinion, for this composition are Giant and Aerial. Aerial's slightly better because Overlords have a lot of use in this comp, but Giant is completely fine as well. You don't really mind that much about the 10 range from Aerial, so they're pretty close. I would say these are the worst for my playstyle, next to Elite Specialist. Definitely not in the same like tier of having issues as Elite does. It's just these are a little bit harder to extract value out of with the comp, since you don't have really that much use for Giants in most cases. Not to say that you cannot, but it's just my playstyle to not do that. So, that being said, I think that most specialists for this board are completely fine. Ones I would recommend you stay away from are Elite, and to a lesser extent, Giant and Aerial. And the ones I would recommend you to try and get the most often is Quick Supply and Supply Specialist. It is worth mentioning, by the way, that for me as a player, I will almost always make my decision about my start based on the units that it comes with rather than the starting specialist that it has. This is only not true in the case of Elite, which, like I said earlier, I would stay away from at all costs. But generally speaking, I would recommend that you take the units that you are most comfortable playing an opener with, more so than I would recommend that you take a specialist that you think is slightly better or slightly worse. Next, let's cover pivoting. So pivoting is something that's a very, very complex topic, and I won't try and cover every possibility, but let's talk about the most common things. So the most common thing that people will try and do to steal Mustang in the current meta is hackers. So what hackers require you to do is to have charge shot Phoenixes or artillery cannon overlords, or even just overlords in general, to execute your steel balls or your Mustangs or whatever once they get hacked. And sometimes that is enough, depending on the board state. Other times it will not be, and the reason that sometimes it is not is because, especially if you've clicked lifesteal on your steel balls, or energy absorption, whatever you want to call it, that if your opponent clicks enhanced control on their hackers, the tech which makes them hack with full HP, then that tends to have a snowball effect on them hacking your steel balls, which can cause you to have very big problems as far as like winning the board state after that. And for that reason, that's why I mentioned that you want to have something that can execute your steel balls with burst damage once they get hacked. Either cannon overlords or charge shot phoenixes. And I think that is a generally okay answer to hackers. However, I will say that generally what you end up having to do once that happens is selling all of your non-snowballed steel balls or non-itemized steel balls that have levels, because they will just get hacked too quickly and mess up your army too much. And often what I have to do once that occurs is I have to go into Overlord carry, or even just some sort of different board entirely to close out the game. Or it might even just be too much at that point. The hackers may be too strong and the game may be over. So for that reason, I will say the hackers are quite dangerous. Okay, so hackers aside, what else is really dangerous? So the other thing that I find really hard to deal with is extended range Vulcan. I forget which of these tabs has the cards in it. Here it is. Extended range Vulcan. So this is also a very, very difficult thing to deal with, because Vulcans in general are quite weak into this board without items or without cards. But if your opponent has an extended range Vulcan and has perhaps, say, maybe like a damage item or charge demo or something like that on it, it will be very, very, very hard to deal with, and you might just like lose the game on the spot. So for that reason, if you see extended range Vulcan in the cards and it's very, very early and your opponent takes it, I would highly recommend that you consider pivoting to a different board, or that you maybe definitely watch out for that and see if your opponent takes it or not. I would say that these are the two most problematic things for the board. Other than that, sometimes very early giants that have items can be difficult to deal with. Maybe like a fortress with a super heavy armor or something like that. Maybe you need to pivot the board at that point too. But the most dangerous things are those two. Extended range Vulcan, or just Vulcan with a very heavy damage item, can be very dangerous as well. But particularly extended range is quite hard to deal with. It does make it squishier, but oftentimes that isn't very relevant, because if you're getting to shoot the Vulcan, it's already dead, either to a charged shot Phoenix or to a steel ball, ripping its damage on it. But for the most part, I would say that those two things are the biggest things to watch out for. There are definitely other things that can cause you to need to pivot in the game, and definitely like just feel that out as you need to in your current board state when you're playing. But those are the things that I would look out for personally as the most dangerous. As a reminder to close out the video, the tips I'm giving you in this guide are intended to serve as a baseline for you to modify to fit your current board state. Whether it's positioning, units, techs, or whatever else, just don't be afraid to do something entirely different if your intuition says it might be good. Be creative, be flexible, and most of all, just trust yourself. If I can hit this orbital javelin on my opponent's Vulcan before he places it, Consider subscribing to the channel or checking out my stream on Twitch. I'm Time for Miracle. Thanks for watching.
Because I could have got this yesterday on a fortress, because there was a fortress-shaped hole in my opponent's formation. But I just said, yeah, there's probably going to be a fortress here, but there's probably a play that's just as good as killing his fortress instantly. And so I made the play that's just as good, and I killed him that turn. But yeah, we're going to see if he puts the fork in there. It worked! Yes! Yes! I love it. Oh my god.